Good afternoon, and welcome to the second webinar in the Accelerated Learning Summer Webinar Series. Our presenter this afternoon is Dr. John Woodward. Dr. Woodward is currently Distinguished Professor Emeritus and past Dean of the School of Education at the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma, Washington. The majority of his research has focused on mathematics and technology-based instruction. Dr. Woodward is currently a panel member for the revised version of Assisting Students Struggling in Mathematics, Response to Intervention for Elementary Schools. We are honored to welcome Dr. Woodward for today's webinar.
Good afternoon, I guess it is good afternoon your time. I'm going to kick into the slides right now simply because we are short on time. So off we go. And again, please by all means use the chats as questions come up. I could fill this hour, and I'm sure you've been through these kinds of presentations before with tables, 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 and charts, charts, charts. And it can be particularly overwhelming in new areas such as mathematics for some people. And to get the general drift of what directions we were taking today in a contemporary sense in mathematics and in how we use that knowledge in the context of the accelerated learning that's part of the Michigan Initiative. What I'm going to do today instead is going to follow a different strategy. And if you'll bear with me, we're going to work with the spoken word today. I'm going to go deep in terms of the kinds of conversations we can have with all students in classrooms and ensure the fact that along several dimensions or as many dimensions as possible, we can keep children in elementary schools, and that'll be the particular focus, abreast of the mathematics they need as they go through over the K through 5 years. The perspective comes from over 36 years, as you can see on the slide. As an education researcher, I've developed curriculum for middle school interventions for kids who are failing in mathematics. And I'm also actively involved in professional development for elementary and middle school teachers. And the last topic in particular is an eye toward Tier 1 classrooms, particularly where kids are struggling to keep pace with all the other students in the class. It kind of goes thematically from my experience without saying that over the 2 decades since the big emphasis on reading interventions, that elementary grades disproportionately favor that kind of literacy instruction and interventions. That math phobia is not uncommon. It's not just elementary school teachers. It's it's a common trait, obviously, among the American population. A good number of people do not feel competent and successful in the area of mathematics. And as a past dean of a school of education, it was decades of experience that made it pretty clear to me that as you raise the demands, the standards for pre-service education in particular, to get what are called turnkey teachers, that is to say teachers who can come in and just institute all of the practices that research requires, that's an incredibly tall order. It just can't be done in that fashion. And continued professional development, which is a theme across many successful countries, is the kind of thing that needs to occur. And the teacher shortages, I was actually spent the weekend in Texas with family down there, and many of them are educators, and we were talking about this at one point. The shortage in the area of math is only growing, and as the slide indicates, you can blame Amazon and iPhone for that. But in all seriousness, this actually was articulated 15 years ago in this book called Tough Choices, Tough Times, and it makes a lot of sense. As the economy shifts further and further toward a high-tech workforce, a workforce where the competencies in mathematics are becoming more and more important, those people are drawn further and further into sectors of employment that are not in education. They're in all areas of the economy, and as a consequence, it makes the issues of what we're going to talk about today even more imperative in terms of professional development. The other things I would say along the lines of struggling students is that they often fall faster behind than we think. I mean, there's this notion that it'll be a couple of years before the deficits become apparent. And as the presenter said just a few moments ago, we end up spending all our time trying to remedy those deficits much too late. We need to kind of address these issues as they occur, as soon as they start to appear. And it becomes only more complicated, obviously, as you get to the older grade levels. Middle school, in my view, is probably the last stop before you can do any kind of comprehensive intervention. And that this is going to be central to what I'm going to talk about this morning. When we started our research years ago, focusing on what the effects of ambitious curriculum, if you want to call it that. Some of it at the time was funded by the National Science Foundation. The curriculum, creates such a high ceiling in terms of performance that one of the first things we observed in classrooms is those who are falling behind take on an incredibly passive role in the classroom. It's a difficult thing for a teacher who has 25 or 30 students in the class to get to everyone and to attend to their needs and make sure that they are also active participants in the classroom. And that in the intermediate grades in particular, this is where a lot of kids go invisible. And it's only sort of addressed in a fairly blunt and pronounced fashion by the time the kids are reorganized with their schedules when they hit the middle grades. So we found in trying to address the tier 1 issues, small group instruction periodically can make a world of difference in terms of the assistant kids need. And that also a theme, and this will appear in the last example that I provide in this presentation this morning. Visual representations are enormous. I'll talk about the research on that as we go through the remaining time. And that the other theme that's important is for those kids who need this added practice and kind of just-in-time assistance, it also has to be done in the areas of conceptual understanding and problem solving. And problem solving is going to be, the theme that's going to be the core of what we're talking about this morning. In my view, we're kind of way beyond the math wars that were pretty much settled 10 years or so ago. I think, if there's a statement to be made, what's at stake in the world of math today is it simply demands more. And this is, I think, largely the function of technology as much as anything else. A book among many from a psychological perspective that lays out this theme, and this is not specific to mathematics, but this unified learning model does a nice job of talking about the range of skills, if you want to call it that math draws upon in the brain. You have high-level tasks, concepts, problem solving, low-level tasks where you need to be automatic and fluent. There's also the visual and the symbolic. Those two factors, the visual and symbolic, are sort of at the cutting edge of where neuroscience is today in the area of mathematics. And just to put it simply, I could go on for quite a bit on this, but we don't have the time. There's a kind of a whole linguistic aspect of short-term memory that, if enhanced, and I'm sure folks like Sharon Vaughn addressed this kind of issue, certainly lead to greater competence in the area of reading. In the case of mathematics, there's this visual sketch pad that research is starting to indicate, if developed and enhanced significantly, can also lead to higher performance in the area of mathematics. And the kind of element that binds a lot of this together is talk, classroom discussion. Unless you can read minds, having classroom discussions at the very least serves as a function for formative assessment on the part of a teacher. Are kids getting it on an ongoing basis? Do I need to go back, redo what I do? Am I moving forward at the appropriate pace? Classroom discussions can be instrumental. And this takes us back to the earlier point that I made. If kids in large classroom settings are passive and silent, we don't have a good read on where they are, what they need, what their competence levels are. And that's going to move us toward a kind of instruction that is going to be at the core of what I'm going to talk about. Now, for academically low achieving kids, the focus unfortunately tends to be simply on the areas that are, outlined in red, the symbolic, number of operations, and then automaticity around facts. The core of what I want to focus on is an idea of what I call coherent instructional routines. And the topic is going to be, in this case, around problem solving. It could be around understanding concepts like the ideas that underlie fractions or rational numbers or ratios and proportions, but we're going to focus on problem solving today. And the context is going to be this: in a tier 1 context, it's added support that occurs through either paraprofessionals, co-instruction with special educators, or what has been called in the past, and there are various names for it, it's ad hoc grouping by grade levels, which means, in effect, that grade level teachers are going to pair up, and their goal is to have disproportionate classrooms on certain bases. The examples I'm going to give involve teachers pairing up just once a week for a half an hour during the week to do small group for one classroom, very large group for the other classroom, all with the purpose of those kids who are, having a difficult time keeping up, participating in smaller groups where they have a chance to be called on, given feedback, et cetera, et cetera. And there are lots of scenarios for this kind of thing. As I said, there's the pair grade level teachers, the regular classroom teacher, the special educator, the teacher, and a paraprofessional. In the research that I've been involved in, which I'll talk about in a few slides, how often this occurs is to be determined. It all depends upon the logistics of setting all of this up, the competency levels of teachers, and as well as, how frequently you can have these kind of small group activities. Ideally, and again, a lot of the intervention work that we've done in the elementary grade levels has involved using paraprofessionals to offload the time so that teachers can address the needs of kids who are starting to fall behind, which is in keeping with what our opening presenter was talking about. Why problem solving? Well, it's only the framework that Singapore now uses for its curriculum. They, by the way, are well beyond this whole idea that we have in the United States that the key to Singapore's instruction is their very thin math curriculum. That is something that they developed in the 1980s and 1990s, and they've moved beyond that, and because of their efforts to stay abreast of the most recent mathematics in the world today, have focused the core of what they do around problem solving. And part of that is just to keep kids engaged, keep them applying their understanding in a variety of contexts. As for the ad hoc grouping, this is something that actually occurs in a significant way in another high-performing country in the world, in Finland. And the research indicates that by 8th grade, approximately half of the students in Finland receive dynamic grouping of some kind across the first 8 grades of their experience. That's one of the things that keeps them up to speed. And again, this is incredibly consistent with the themes that our opening presenter talked about. So that, when teachers start to identify that kids are falling behind, in the case of a country like Finland, they work with those kids in small groups or special sessions, added points in the day, so that they can keep up with instruction. And in that way, they've lowered the number of kids who actually end up in special education. And I should say, in the context, and I've done a lot of work in the area of international education, I'm not suggesting here that we just adopt whole cloth the strategies of all these different countries. That was an idea that was tried or thought about in the 1980s with Japan, and again in the early 2000s with Singapore, and culture interferes with that very idea. Instead, it's something that when you see best practices, what the world has been doing, and it continues to do, is adopt some of those practices and get them to fit inside of a national context and curriculum. As far as the research support, Melissa referred to this first document, which, by the way, is now available. All of these are online. They can be downloaded from the What Works Clearinghouse, the Institute for Educational Sciences. The Assisting Struggling Students is probably one of the most popular guides. These, by the way, are free. They're in PDF form. They're very readable. They're designed for practitioners, and not their very big academic texts. And in fact, they're probably much like the materials that Michigan has created and is continuing to create, and gives a sense of what research says are important practices in the classroom. And so I was a panel member on the first one. The updated version, I think, is far superior to the initial one in terms of its contents and the way in which its contemporary perspective is presented. The middle one, I was actually the panel chair on the problem solving, which kind of reinforces the issues that I'm going to talk about in this presentation. And its focus is on grades through 4 through 8. Again, giving very practical guidelines and recommendations for practice in teaching problem solving. The last one has to do with effective practices for, at the elementary grade level, what many have called, rightfully so, the gateway to higher mathematics, which is fractions. And just to put a point on that statement, the gateway, fractions is a whole different way of looking at the world. And if we don't really have a deep understanding of it, if we don't get beyond, well, here's a pie diagram, here's what 3/4 looks like, now let's add and subtract fractions. If we don't have a conceptual understanding of what we're doing, then we'll never be successful in those particular areas, and that will impede our understanding of ratios and proportions, algebra, and thereafter. So, if you want sort of practitioner-oriented but highly research-based documents to support a lot of what I'm going to be talking about, these are just 3 of them. Got a problem for you real quick. One of the things that we try to do in professional development is engage you, the learner, in simulate your experience to what kids experience on a day in, day out basis. You can see it right here. A bat and a ball cost $1.10. The ball costs $1 more than the bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Give you 1 second more to think about the answer. And I could poll you on this, but in all likelihood, unless you're an exception, you're likely to say the ball costs 10 cents, which is really only half correct, strange as that may sound. Because here's the issue. You got the bat, the ball, and the difference. Remember, the problem was the bat and the ball cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. If the ball costs 10 cents, the bat costs $1. The difference is 90 cents, not $1. Okay? Now, this is kind of what you might call a bar joke in a way, because you're lulled or tricked into this kind of an answer. And when I was presented with it years ago, what intrigued me about the problem wasn't that it was clever or cute, but why was it a problem? What was it about the problem that made it, difficult? And the issue is structurally, well, there are 2 things here at play. One is that 2 conditions have to be satisfied. The bat and the ball have to sum to $1.10. But the second condition is the difference between the bat and ball has to be $1. And that's something we don't readily see. The other thing that's unique about this kind of problem is its structure. We don't know what the bat costs. We don't know what the ball costs, but we do know the total. And in the context of cognitively guided instruction, which I'm going to talk about in a few slides, this is not a structure we ever teach kids. It's actually, if you want to do it mathematically, the most efficient way to do it is to use high school level mathematics, simultaneous equations. I won't get into all of that. And by the way, if you're wondering, the answer to the problem is the bat costs $1.05, the ball costs 5 cents, so $1.05 and 5 is $1.10, and the difference is $1. So rather than torture you and have you distracted and trying to think about the answer, that's the answer to the problem. But it leads to a couple of very important points, the first of which is this issue of structure. The second point it leads to that I really want to underscore about problem solving, because it's so far away from the kinds of practices that you see in classrooms in general, not just elementary classrooms, classrooms across the board. Problem solving is very much about the relationships between different quantities. That's the work we have to do to get kids to think actively about problems. And they don't have to be multi-sentence, paragraph long, or, mind benders that go on for a half an hour. They can be relatively short problems, but if we're thoughtful about it, the goal that we're after is to get kids to read and understand a problem and then start to visualize in their head the relationship between different quantities. That's really one of the core components of problem solving that not many people think about. So now when we get to a more common kind of problem, if I were to give this to you first, one of the difficulties adults have is you see a problem like this and think, well, what's so difficult about this? Kara has 9 coins. She gets 5 more coins from her brother. How many coins does she have? These things seem very straightforward, and they're not sensitive to where a lot of learners are, especially learners that might, have second language issues or, maybe struggling linguistically with relating these kinds of quantities. But the problem that's on the screen right now, unfortunately, is the stereotype of the kind of problem found in a lot of elementary school curriculum, where you have a known quantity, and an unknown quantity, and the structure is typically now practice 15 more of this. Now, that said, there are a bunch of innovative curricula out there that depart from this kind of structure and do things more akin to what I'm going to talk about. But historically, this has been, the traditional way in which, quote unquote, problem solving has been taught in classrooms. So in this cognitively guided instruction, which actually started just to the west of you in Wisconsin and Madison, they did a lot of really good work in the 90s, late 80s and 1990s on the different kinds of problems that kids need to work with. They created or found different types of problems, but the most innovative thing they did is they started to play around with the different structure of the problems. And you'll see this in the words that are highlighted in kind of the salmon color. So in the first case, you have the problem I talked about where, the unknown quantity is at the end. Kara has 9 coins. She gets 5 more from her brother. How many does she have? Known, known, unknown. And then, interestingly enough, and I think this was incredibly innovative, they started putting the unknown quantity next in the middle. And then finally, they had structures where the unknown quantity was at the beginning. Now, it seems a little, for folks who are not out there, in the audience who aren't familiar with this, it seems a little mind-boggling to start with the notion that Kara had some coins. I mean, who would think of something like that? But the purpose of varying this structure is to get kids to think about these relationships between quantities. In this last case, which is of course the most challenging, you have an unknown quantity, a known quantity, and a known quantity. That's the one I kind of want to try to focus on in the time that we have and get into the dialogue in a small group setting that can improve kids' ability to think in a problem-solving context. To go back for a moment, as I said, cognitively guided instruction identified essentially 4 different types of problems. And I won't get into the details simply because of the time, but you have join, which basically add together, separate, remove. So she gave 8 coins away and removed from the set. A part-part whole structure, which has its own language challenges, because in this case, we're talking about nickels, dimes, and the larger category of coins. But what I want to focus on instead is what are called comparison problems. And if you look at documents like even the Common Core standards, this particular type of problem is referenced in the back of the standards as a very important type of problem to be able to teach to 1st and 2nd grade kind of kids. So in this case, Kara has 9 coins. And the idea here is you're breaking the back of keywords as an approach to problem solving. She has 5 more coins than her brother. How many coins does her brother have? Well, if you read through the problem quickly, just like I say, a bat and a ball costs $1.10, many kids are likely to see, well, or say, as they move on to this problem and the one after that and the one after that, that, her brother has 14 coins, right? They're just going to add the 2 numbers together and then move on to the next problem. The point of cognitive guided instruction is to slow down, initially model this kind of thing to kids, which is what you're going to see a deeper example of on the next few slides. Definitely use manipulatives or representations to assist that kind of understanding. That's going to be absolutely essential to the presentation I'm going to show you in just a moment. And then call on kids to explain their thinking and to have a dialogue where reasoning is at the center of the thinking. Now, having done professional development on this very thing for a decade now in workshops with teachers, what I'm doing now is easier said than done. The very problem we're working on, when you ask teachers to work in pairs, role play, you're the teacher, you're working with a student, it just doesn't, fall right out how easy it is to use manipulatives to explain how this problem works, which is why I want to take the time to do that very thing right now. So I'm going to give you some dialogue that's actually constructed from observations of teachers doing this kind of thing very successfully. And we're at the modeling stage of helping kids understand this kind of problem. So what you're going to see in the salmon kind of colors is we need to think about this for a moment. All right, let's reason about it. Does Kara and her brother have the same number of coins? And that may require rereading or having another student read. And again, remember the context here. We're working in a small group where kids who tend not to participate in class now have opportunities to be called on, to be assisted, to be given feedback, as opposed to sitting silently and who knows whether or not they're getting it or even paying attention. So the context here is where it really matters. In the next phase, reasoning further, so does Kara or her brother have more coins? Right? Logically leading them down the path for thinking about what these words mean. And here's the key transition. As I said in the beginning, and this is supported by the work we did, in the problem-solving guide I referred to slides earlier, visual representations are enormous in making sense of really what amounts for a lot of kids to a sea of words. Okay? So now we have the 9 coins. That's the known quantity. That's what we know. That's what the first sentence is all about. All right? Now, how do we move kids to the second 2 sentences? All right? Identifying the 5 more coins puts in context the relationship between how many more coins Kara has to what her brother has. So our next phase, and we could use other colors if we wanted to, but in this case, keeping it simple, her brother has 4 coins. We can see that Kara has as many as her brother and 5 more, okay? And so that we can write the equation, 5 plus 4 is 9, or 9 minus 5 is 4, isolating the fact that her brother has 4 coins, okay? Now, again, as adults, we can move through this very quickly. It seems so obvious, it's comprehensible. For kids, there's a natural inclination, of course, to focus on keywords like more, simply add without thinking about these kinds of quantitative relationships. Now, the value of doing this kind of work with these kinds of structures actually stems from the fact that the problems, as they're written, are relatively simple, which in the context of, let's suppose we set aside, say as we've done in some research setting, just a half an hour a week to work with small groups. We can take a problem like this, we can work through it for perhaps 4 or 5 minutes, and then the alterations are simply a matter of changing the numbers. And this is something that was really a big insight to me that came from doing the problem-solving guide. When I had a group of experts for this problem-solving guide get together initially, I asked them, what is your vision of problem-solving? I always assumed that every one of these people would say, well, problem solving is this very weighty thing. It takes the entire period to do one problem. There's perspiration, there's tears, there's fear, everything else in the kids' heads. And one guy in particular made a very compelling and I thought incredibly thoughtful argument. He said, in some cases, not all, but in some cases, the metaphor he used is like an underhanded tennis serve. To have an appropriate tennis serve, you need more practice on the same types of problems and those problems in contrast to previous learned kind of problems. So what that offers is the opportunity, even on the fly, to take the first problem we talked about, the 9 coins, 5 more coins than her brother, and simply change the numbers. Or change the context. And another thing that came out of the problem-solving guide, that is actually grounded in research, that I thought was an interesting and startling insight is, if Terrell and Letitia are kids in the classroom, that kind of problem actually has even more meaning. But the ability to adapt in this particular context, to do 3, 4 problems of this kind, to engage all the students in this kind of problem solving, can go a long way to doing something that, primary grade teacher after primary grade teacher will tell you immediately is something that your struggling students definitely are challenged by. It's that intersection of math and language. And what I would argue is, if you try and do this in a whole class with 25, 30 students all the time, you're just going to miss kids. So catching them and meeting their needs in an on-demand basis really argues for this kind of what I call ad hoc grouping structure, so that there are small groups of kids and opportunities for everybody to participate. And so it helps with this dramatic ability to see relationship between quantities. The other argument behind cognitively guided instruction, I think there's more to it than what they say, is that number combinations that lead to facts can also be taught in this context. But for sure, it's a stepping stone to multi-step problem solving that we find so much in our statewide assessments. So, that segment is for sure, I think, underdone in our primary grade classrooms, and it's worth thinking about in the context of the ad hoc grouping that I've just talked about. Now, what I want to do is move up the food chain a little bit. Cognitively guided instruction goes along, obviously, beyond addition and subtraction, deals with multiplication and division. There are different kinds of multiplication problems, different types. There are equal groups, there are arrays, combinations, comparisons. These all require kids to think differently. This is why multiplication is such a difficult idea, all right? Because it just doesn't fall out as one way of thinking. The arrays is basically your area models that underlies, the area in geometry. Equal groups, however, a classic kind of problem would be something like this. I have 24 candies. I want to put 6 candies in each bag for a party. How many bags will I need? This is what's technically called measurement or quotative division. In other words, here's the 24 candies. I know how many parts I'm going to have, how many candies in each bag, but I don't know how many groups I have. And the groups are the bags, okay? Simple problem, and as it's advocated, rightfully so, there aren't any remainders, and it's a way that we get kids to think about a certain kind of multiplication. But what I want to do is come back to another example. This time we used with 5th grade kids who were struggling with problem solving. Once again, once a week, half an hour, 40 minutes. They were working in small groups of 8 to 10 kids. These weren't all, and by the way, I should say, they weren't all the academically low achieving kids. It was a mixture of average and low achieving kids at times. So they were sort of mixed groups, but our intention was to get to kids who were struggling. And I'm going to give you a second to look at this problem. All right. This is an equal groups kind of problem, but it's disguised. And just take a second and you can read it. Now, this is a kind of problem that's not going to be solved in 3 minutes. In fact, this entire problem from beginning to end took about a half an hour, because the beauty of this kind of problem is that another element of problem solving is, if in fact it's truly a problem, then the answer isn't apparent right away. It's not some rule that takes you immediately from A to B. You really have to think about, represent, and model this problem, get your head around it. And in the case of teaching, and again, small groups are instrumental here, teachers are able to scaffold when necessary when kids hit dead ends. So what we use in the context, and you can see that in the picture in the upper left-hand corner, you have a whiteboard, and what's in pink is the problem is written on it so all kids can see it and read it. And what we found, interesting enough, and we just went to Home Depot and got this stuff. I mean, these are small whiteboards. We found that as opposed to sheets of paper and pencils and stuff like that, I mean, they hated writing and erasing, but they loved to be able to do something with a dry ink marker, erasable marker. So after we read and reread the problem, one kid said, I had an idea. And the strategy he used was effectively, in a more formal sense, to make an organized list. And in this case, obviously, he's drawing something that looks akin to a calendar. And the funny part about this part of the observation, and this is really true to what actually happened, the kid started with the calendar structure here, writes the 1, figures out that then a week later it's going to be the 8th, the 15th, the 22nd. I mean, he's about to write on his pants before the teacher pulls back and says, wait a minute, stop. This is 1,000 days. This could take a long time. And by the way, you could get ink all over your pants if you continue on in the fashion you're doing. Let's stop and talk about it. So, at this point, we've got all the kids engaged. And rather than read all this to you, I'm going to give you a few seconds, per slide to just read, and I'll make the key points about the dialogue you're going to see. So take a few minutes and just look at the dialogue, and then I'll just make a comment about this particular slide in the next couple. So one of the really beautiful things that the teacher is doing here, and again, I can't argue enough, I'm just sort of beating a dead horse here, but this doesn't happen this easily in a large class. This is the kind of interaction and feedback she's giving is functionally related to the small group of kids, what she can hear, what she can observe, and there's a very obvious confusion from the get-go. When you think about what's the number for the next week, it's 1 plus 7, it's 8. It's not 7. It doesn't go from 1 to 7 to 14, okay? So that clarification is addressed immediately before kids go off in another direction and start getting it all wrong. The second thing she's doing at the bottom of the slide that is, instrumental for conducting these kinds of dialogues is not jumping in saying, this kid's right, this kid's wrong, but having that settled by the group and listening to their reasoning for it. Okay, so in this particular slide, it ends with Sarah is because Sunday you have to count Monday to get to the 8. So here's our next sequence in the dialogue. What is important here in this segment of the dialogue is she's doing a strategy that I think goes all the way up. I don't care whether you're in college calculus or you're doing problem solving in the 5th grade. Making a simpler version of the problem gives you a fix on how we can start to think about it. So rather than grappling with the entire 1,000 days, she backs off and just says hypothetically, okay, let's suppose it's only 9 days long. How would we think about when it would end? All right. What if it were 17 days long? How would we think about what it would end? So, rather than keep leaving kids as deer in front of the headlight, what she's doing is making it more approachable, something analogous to the original problem, so they can start to think about, well, really, when, if you're, on the track here, she's moving them toward, multiplication and division as a way of thinking about this particular problem. So then there's some silence. So her next move at this point is to get them where the regular classroom with the smaller, simpler kind of equal group problems have taken them. And in cognitively guided instruction, the emphasis is on multiplication and division or inverse operations. You can solve the problem either through multiplication or division. And with 17 days, you can see with the students, 7 goes 2 times with 3 extra days, right? So now we're starting to approach division, and in this case, with remainders, all right? And we can now return to our original representation, Jacob's calendar, and as you'll see in the next slide, he's filling it in all the way to 17 just to be able to validate that 14 days is Sunday, that's 2 weeks, and then 3 more days, okay? The visual representation as a complement to the entire problem, and then answering the question that in this case, if it's 17 days long, the whole thing's going to end on Wednesday. So now we're back to the original problem. And of course, you know, I should have said this in the beginning. They've asked, as they've read the problem, they've addressed the whole concept of what leap years are all about and that kind of thing. And we're back to trying to now use what we've learned with simpler versions of the problem to be able to solve this one. And so, you know, she's sponsoring it to the point where a kid, and again, this is heavily scaffolded, but again, these are kids who are also struggling with the very ideas in simpler problems than the regular classroom involving the cognitively guided instruction. So we can divide 7 into 1,000. She does the work for them because this isn't about the long division operation. She's simply, you know, going to do it herself and have kids work through it so that we get this 142 remainder 6. Which is bringing everybody up to where they are in terms of operations in the regular classroom. Okay, so the 142, by the way, are the groups. They're just like the bags. And I'll just take a second and let you read this because this is a really important slide. So what you can see when she intervenes in the top part of this slide, this is another huge piece in problem solving. One of the questions that teachers ask when they do, you know, repeated types of problems is ask the question, is this like something we've done before? It's an incredibly important prompt. And she's prompting them back to literally the candy bag problem that they'd worked, you know, a few days before, reminding of the big idea, the groups. And in this case, the weeks are the groups. And then what is this 6? Okay, and without getting into the weeds on this one, but this is also a critical piece of where we are in mathematics today. Unlike mathematics of the 20th century, where we just dealt with these remainders as if they were whole numbers, it's critical today that when we get to remainders, kids have also learned something about fractions so that they know that the 6 that remains is a fractional part of the week, which is what this dialogue at the bottom is all about, that it's 6/7. So you can see that in this one problem that seems a little bit foo-foo and frivolous, actually has a lot of meat on the bone. There's a tremendous amount of, you know, multiplication, division, fractions, and remainders that are built inside of this that can be brought to bear on a problem that actually kind of on the outside looks kind of silly. And so finishing this off, we go back to the calendar, you know, and we can see that it ends on Saturday, all right? Everybody agree, they debrief. And to add to this representation a little bit further, we're back to the quantities in each group. And this is what, you know, the teaching around multiplication and division is all about today. Or excuse me, division, I should say. It's either the numbers of groups or the numbers in each group. This is identified in the comparison is made between 6 into 24 and 7 into 1,000. Now, if we were to add to this even further, and it was really extraordinary instruction in its own right, you might take another page and use a linear model like this to show this. You know, linear models are incredibly powerful in a variety of contexts for showing what this unit of 7 is all about and what the remainder is like in relationship to the unit. And in this case, you've got the 7 into the 9 and the 7 into the 17, 2 weeks, and what the remainder is all about. Well, speaking of remainders, I have about 5 more minutes or so before we get to the questions and answers. I said that this presentation was very much about the spoken word. What I want to leave us on is to reinforce 2 points that I made at the beginning of this presentation about how all students, and particularly kids who are struggling in classroom, need additional assistance in terms of both visual representations and conceptual understanding. And the point that I'm going to try and make is through this particular problem, again, it's only about 3 sentences, take a moment and try and get your head around this. Now we're back to the world of putting you, the participant, in the role of a teacher. Think about how you would even try and solve this problem in your head without any other assistance. So if I'm talking to myself, I say, okay, she's got 2/5 of the money she had on a coat. Then she spent a third, what? A third of what was left on the sweater. And there's 150, what? I mean, this is incredibly confusing. And it drives home the challenges first grade kids who are struggling have with the Kara and her brother and the coins problem. Okay. Now, if you go to the old world of problem solving, one of the first recommendations that was always made is, well, you can make it a lot easier by drawing a picture. But frankly, I think the coats and the sweaters and the pictures that I've captured here don't help us a heck of a lot, which gets us to the difference that's fundamental. And this goes to the heart of a lot of research that we did in elementary school classrooms. What was fascinating to us throughout the era of statewide assessments as they arose, and then the problems that they had that were very difficult on those statewide assessments, and as teachers were trying to prepare kids for those assessments, relatively few teachers had the background or inclination to use appropriate visual representations, not drawings, but visual representations to take all this muddy water you see in those sentences up there and clarify it in any way. This is basically, it's been called in the literature the difference between pictures and diagrams. Or in this particular case, we're going to be using what's called a tape diagram, which comes out of Singapore. So as you know, I would argue, and I probably don't think anybody would disagree, the code on the left doesn't help us one iota. But here's the point about using a visual representation. You have to have used it before you get to a problem like this. Anytime you use a tool to help kids visualize and understand a problem, they should have familiarity with that tool. Absolutely imperative. Otherwise, they're learning both at once, which makes the whole thing an entirely different order. Now, unfortunately, I think for some of you, I'm thrusting you into this position, but I think I can kind of make it somewhat straightforward. And my purpose here is to show you how much this tape diagram on the right helps us make sense of what the heck's going on in the problem above. So here we go. The first statement indicates there are 5 parts of the money that she has, okay? And I'm just going to bore down on the representation and the concepts that are underneath. So if she had 5 parts and she spent 2/5 of that on the coat, you can see that bracket up on the top up above. Those 2 rectangles on the left indicate what she spent on the coat. Now here's the huge move. If she spent that money, the 2/5 on the coat, she now has 3 of those rectangles remaining, the 3/5, right? That's how much she had after she spent the money on the coat. But here's where fractions come in. The hardest thing, or one of the most central things about understanding concepts like fractions, crazy it may sound, is what's the whole? Before she ever spent her money, it was all 5 of those rectangles. But once she spent 2 of those rectangles, the 2/5, the whole is now just those 3 rectangles. That's the remaining money. That's the 3/3. That's the whole. And from that whole, she's spending 1/3 of it on a sweater. And I hope that that's clear. And I'll just go through it one more time. Initially, the whole was 5/5. There were 5 parts and she had all of it. She spent 2 of the 5 parts, 2/5, on a coat. What's off to the right is what was remaining. Once you get rid of the coat, now we have a new whole. And the whole is only 3 parts or 3/3. And of the 3/3, she's going to spend 1/3 of it, as this now indicates, on a sweater. All right.
The group was having a nice chat in the chat box around the tapes and the visual representation and the use of those as early as kindergarten and all the way up into middle school. And I had posed the question about using those in high school. And it looked like some folks were also indicating that they've used those successfully all the way up through high school.
Good. Yeah. It's actually just about the end of the slides anyway. So I think I had 1 or 2 left. So we're fine.
Great.
To answer, or have we hit the end?
We just about hit 1 o'clock. If you're willing to stay on, I can pose.
Absolutely. I'm actually terrible that I've never had that happen before, so I don't know what went on.
No problem. So the first question that came up, and we'll record this, so folks have to drop off that can access it through the recording. The first question that came up is, how do we get schools to focus more time on math remediation without taking away from ELA?
Well, and that's been the traditional challenge, right? And it has to do with resource distribution, all the expertise and everything else. I would love to say there are simple problems to this, but one of the oldest problems that's been tossed around is to have greater levels of expertise, almost like math experts per grade level, so that if you try to get everybody up to speed, that's a problem. And this is the most ambitious answer to your question, is that you have, people who are good at math, teaching the math, and you're trading classrooms and doing that kind of stuff. The other kind of way to get at it is to start, that's the high end of the spectrum. The low end of the spectrum makes it more approachable. And this is kind of what we did with paraprofessionals and parent volunteers who were decent in math, is to give them highly focused roles, right? To create these small group levels of assistance and do more than just flashcards. So a big debate I've even had with the NCTM folks is, you could get people who don't have a lot of math training to do very focused problem solving and that alone, right? And do the kind of adaptations for kids who are struggling in math, simpler problems, small groups, that kind of stuff. So that's at the other end of the spectrum, and a lot of stuff in between.
Yeah, we have one participant who said they have some teachers who are teaming even in grade 1, and the teachers really like being able to focus on one content area and being able to go deeper.
Right, and this is kind of glib, I've said this, you can't find people on Wall Street who could do the reading, writing, and math that we expect of elementary school teachers in schools today. And it's just, the demands are enormous. And this whole notion that reading is rocket science, that is true.
Mm-hmm.
It's just math, right?
Yeah, quite literally. Another question that came up is there an optimal small group size?
I would say the boundaries start to hit the boundaries around 10. You get too small, then it's just a chat with 2 or 3 people. The thing that's kind of interesting, and I didn't make a point of this, is that we have this traditional vision that each child has to shoulder all of the knowledge. A big piece of the experience we found in these small group settings is that different kids participate at different times. So it's a collective activity rather than everybody needs to do all of it by themselves. And that's really beneficial because kids learn from each other.
Mm-hmm.
Scaffolding, can kind of take place accordingly.
Perfect. Another question that came up was, how do you transition kids to start asking the comparison questions for themselves?
Well, I think that, one of the points that I made earlier about I think I used the underhanded tennis serve, is that with these simpler problems that can be done in 4 or 5 minutes, once you do one problem, it's very much like it actually came out of Michigan, Anne-Marie Palansar at the University of Michigan in reciprocal teaching. The teacher starts to remove his or her role from it and get kids to answer the questions or ask the questions themselves. And if you're using parallel problems, ones that have been modified with just different numbers, for example, you can move in that direction to where the kids start to take over the learning tasks and the teachers are gradually removed. It's a similar kind of thinking.
Yeah. And then the last question is my question is, what is on your professional reading list for this summer?
Oh, on my professional reading list for this summer. Well, actually, I'm reading in the math area or just?
Yeah, in math.
I'm actually reading this. It's funny, I pulled it off the shelf a couple of nights ago. It has to do with math in the physical world, how that all developed, how they started over time using the geography in the world around them and then gradually transformed it into mathematics. I mean, there's a part of math that we don't think about. It's just how it evolved and the problems in the physical world that arose and then became mathematical. So it's just quirky interest.
Yeah, no, that's great. Well, I just want to, on behalf of Michigan, I want to thank you for your time today and for joining us. It was a great presentation and lots of excitement that was generated in the conversation, and then they kept going even though we lost you for a few minutes. So that tells you how exciting the topic is.
Exactly. Added excitement, the whole thing just bombing at the end. But, I mean, it was ironic because that was the very end of the presentation practically. But my mouse froze. I'm on a different computer right now. So I thought rather than rebooting, I'd just get on this.
Well, thank you for making the space for us and for coming back. We really appreciate it. There's a lot of thanks in the chat coming through.
All right. Well, good. I appreciate it. Anytime.
All right. Have a good rest of your day.
Yeah, you too. Have a great day. Thank you.